Okay, so this talk I'm going to present to CCSW in London on Monday. And so I've got only 15 minutes, it's going to be a short talk. And so this is Community MPC via Triples as a service, and this is joint work with Nigel. And so the idea is to outsource the heavy preprocessing of MPC, basically. So first, what is MPC? So like this is in the two-party setting, and so the basic idea of MPC is you have two parties, Alice and Bob, and they both have a value and they want to compute an agreed function without revealing their inputs, and they want to get the output of this agreed function. And so this is like the classic bunker problem. So Alice has like a cash amount, Bob has also a cash amount, they want to know who is the richest, and so Bob is the richest here. And the caveat is like, this is a bit slow, usually. So what we have done in the MPC community is like people have thought about this, and they have proposed what we call the pre-processing framework. And so basically the idea is Alice and Bob are going to engage in an offline phase before doing the actual computation, and this offline phase is going to be input and function independent. And through this offline phase, they are going to compute what we call correlated randomness, which are these boxes here, which you can think about as the commodity in Community MPC. And so once they have done this offline computation and they have this commodity, they go to the online phase, and now they can use this commodity and they can use it once, so they kind of open the commodities, and thanks to this, the offline phase is now much faster, and it's basically only information theoretic computation and communication. And so we kind of offload the public key crypto or the obvious transfer or whatever you can think about to generate the commodities to what we call to the offline phase. And so our idea is to outsource this not to the offline phase for Alice and Bob, but to actually outsource the offline phase to servers in the cloud. And so that's what we are going to try to do. So to show you what we've done, I'm going to explain a bit in more detail how you construct MPC, and so what you want to be able to do to achieve the outsourcing. So first, we are going to work in the linear secret sharing scheme on additive sharings in the just so-called speeds setting. And so what does that mean? That means that the data values are actually shared in an additive way. And so like if you take the x, for example, so to share an x, you're gonna kind of compute x1 up to xn, and you want the sum of this xi to equals x, and pi only holds xi and does not know anything about the other shares. So that's what an additive sharing means. But the caveat is like for the speeds protocol, which we want to be maliciously secure, you want to add to it a MAC, an information theoretic MAC. And this is where the problem comes, basically. And so quickly a MAC is done as such. So the parties are also going to have a sharing of a MAC key, a global MAC key. And so then an authenticated sharing is now going to be the additive sharing of the value and the additive sharing of the multiplication between the MAC key and the value. And so for each value, you want to have actually both to have an authenticated sharing. And at the end of the online protocol, the parties are going to open the values and check that the MAC holds to be sure that the computation was done correctly and that no party acted maliciously. And so now what we want to do is we want to have the ability to do two operations basically on our sharings. We want to be able to add them and multiply them. So addition is for free because we work on an additive scheme. And so as you can see, it's kind of trivial to have the sharing of an addition. You just locally add the sharings. So this is pretty easy. And the multiplication, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated because it involves these commodities or these commodities which seen earlier. And these commodities are called Beaver Triples. And so what's the Beaver triple? It's basically a triple A, B, and C, such that C is equal to A times B. And so parties are going to need to hold authenticated shard of the Beaver triples to be able to perform multiplication. And so how does that work? So once they have sharing of the triple and sharing on the values they want to multiply, they are going to open these maskings on the two values they want to multiply, x and y. And they're going to open epsilon and delta. And they then will be able to actually compute a linear combination of these openings and secret sharings. And so this, since this is a linear operation, this can be done locally. And so basically, the multiplication now becomes a linear combination of known terms and secrets. So that's how we do multiplication. And that's why you actually need the pre-processing in the offline phase to be able to do multiplication. The caveat here is that Beaver triples are kind of computationally expensive, and so it'd be nice if we can outsource their production to the cloud and be able to ask the cloud for these triples and still have a kind of a secure scheme. And so our contribution basically does that, and this improves on a work done by Skoll, Smart, and Wood, which was kind of doing the same, but the thing is, in the earlier work, the MAC has to be fixed at the beginning of the protocol, so basically the cloud had to know the MAC before generating the triples, and we want to avoid that to be able to dynamically choose the computing parties. So the improvement comes from there. And we also kind of want to be as close as possible to the communication model envisioned by Beaver in his commodity cryptography paper. I say as close as possible because we don't quite get there, but I'm going to talk about this a bit later. And so our adversary model is as such. So in the outsourcing model, we have a set of service providers, which we denote SP, and a set of computing parties, which we denote CP, and we have actually M computing parties. And so the interesting thing is that the service provider and the computing parties are both going to be working on different MPC schemes. And so the service provider are going to work on, say, for simplicity, a Shamir secret sharing scheme. And we actually only want a multiplicative Q2 linear secret sharing scheme, but the Shamir secret is probably the most known. And so, and the computing parties are actually going to use the SPITS protocol as we've seen earlier, so with the required Beaver triple to do multiplication. And so, since SP works in an honest majority setting and CP works in a dishonest majority setting, our adversary for the whole protocol can actually corrupt at the same time an honest and minority of the service providers and up to M-1 computing parties. So, and so the adversary can actively corrupt them because we work in the malicious case in both secret chain schemes. So how does the protocol look like? So basically here you have the 4 different steps of our protocol, and so at the leftmost you can see the service providers communicating between them to generate the Beaver triples. And so this is why I say that we kind of get to Beaver's communication model, but not quite, because ideally we would want to avoid this communication between the service providers, but we didn't find any way to do so. But we try to limit the communication among the SPs. And so once the pre-processing between the SP is done, basically, or is ready, the set of computing parties can send a request to the service providers via a ledger, and we actually need the ledger because we want to avoid the double spending of the commodities. So like usually you want the ledger to avoid double spending of cryptocurrencies, and in our case, the resource is the commodities, and so we use the ledger to avoid double spending of the commodities. And so the request is sent to the ledger, and the service provider is going to read the ledger. And the next step is to actually reshare the Beaver triples from the service provider to the computing parties. And so like these 3 steps are basically our protocol. And so the goal is that at the end of these 3 steps, the computing parties want to be able to perform the online phase of speeds as if they had produced the triples themselves. And so basically step A, B, and C is an emulation of the offline phase of speeds for the computing parties. And so I'm going to go in a bit more detail about phase A, B, and C. And so first, phase A. So basically, this is basically here the service provider will have to compute those Beaver triples, so they're gonna have to use the multiplicative property of the Shamir of the secret sharing scheme to be able to compute this C, which is equal to A times B. And I mean, like, this is easy to do, and this is quite fast also. And you have to know that at this point, the service provider don't have any information about the MAC key, which is going to be used in the later online phase, because they don't even know which computing parties are going to ask them for their commodities. The drawback, though, is that for protocol to work, the service provider has to generate 4 triples per triples that they are going to be able to reshare, because we're going to use 3 multiplication during the resharing, and so we're going to have to use 3 triples for the resharing of of 1 triple. So the second step is the request, and so at this point, the computing parties have to agree on a MAC key, which they're going to use later in the online phase, and so they send the request to the ledger, and so in this request they're going to say the number of triples they want, but also, and most importantly, they're gonna have to reshare their share of the MAC key. So this might sound a bit weird, but it's actually quite easy to do because both schemes are linear, and so to reshare a sharing is quite easy. Every party is gonna secret share its share in the new sharing scheme, and the SP and the target SP is just gonna add up the sharing, and it's gonna end up with a sharing of the initial share in his own scheme. And we're going to use the same trick back to be able to reshare the triples. And so the request is done there, and the MAC key is only generated at this point. So this is like the novelty. This is a novelty in our scheme. And so the last step is actually the resharing of the triples from the service provider to the computing parties. And so at this point, the service provider don't have to talk to each other. And actually, like, even at this point, the service provider don't have to talk to each other anymore. So that's the communication model we wanted to kind of achieve. And so at this point, the service providers know a share of the MAC key, which is going to be used, and they also have the pre-computed triples from the first step. And so what happens is that for each triples they want to reshare, they're going to take the 3 elements of the triples, and they're going to reshare it one by one. So they're going to reshare A, B, and C separately. And to also have a reshare the MAC of the MAC on each data value, they're going to use what we could think of like a one-way interactive Beaver multiplication. So that's kind of an odd name, but I'm going to explain it. And so basically, they're going to use the 3 additional triples that they had pre-computed on top of the triples that they want to reshare. And so for each of the data values they want to reshare, they're going to sacrifice triples to be able to compute the product between the global MAC key and the value they want to reshare. And so how does that work? Well, basically, if you go to how the Beaver multiplication works, they're gonna broadcast, each of the service provider is gonna broadcast the local masking they do, so the local share they have on epsilon and delta, and they can do that because they have a share of the MAC key and a share of the value they want to reshare, and so they're gonna broadcast this sharing to each parties in the computing party. And since it's an honest scheme, since it's an honest majority scheme, the parties in CP are going to be able to open it securely, and they're going to be able to know that it was actually a good sharing of epsilon and delta, and then the computing parties are going to be able to compute the linear operation shown at the bottom because they have all the information they need to. And so that's basically how they achieve the resharing of both the triples and the mic and the triple. And that's like basically the core of our protocol. And so we've done that for the triple, but in speeds, you also have secret masks to be able to do the input. And so we also show in the paper that you can do that for the mask without any additional problem. And we prove that this resharing protocol is actually UC secure. And so it completely emulates the offline phase of speeds for the computing parties. That's it.